Well, learned two lessons so far this morning. I think one is always take a Christian Uber, and the second is never give a guy who makes Christian toys the mic. That's Will. I think he missed that. Gosh, it's a privilege to be with you. Is this a little loud? Can you hear me? Okay. All right. It's truly a joy to be with you. I've been friends with Paul for many years now. He's been such a great supporter of our work at Praxis in many different ways, and the chance to speak with you all about your life and work is a privilege that I couldn't have imagined a few years ago, and just feel in God's grace to get the chance to talk with you. I guess my prayer for us this morning is that we would together build a redemptive imagination together. As you hear me talk about this idea, understand that one, this is not me saying I've got this figured out and I hope you get it figured out too, but a work in progress for all of us, but an important one, I hope. And two, that I think wherever we are in life, be it looking for a new opportunity, maybe in a line of work that isn't our dream job, or maybe being right in the center of what we always hoped, there's always new imaginative possibility for what God would have for us in this very moment. And so I hope we can hear those things together. I want to talk about just this idea of redemptive work in the first place, and talk a bit about maybe why I think this is so important. I'm going to go pretty quickly through this, but if you happen to want any of the slides or anything, Paul can make them available to you. Basically, three reasons I think redemptive work is so important for us as Christians right now. First is that the workplace is the primary environment where we both create the world that we then inhabit as other people, and also where we get to interact with the values and worldviews and perspectives of others, and others interact with ours, right? The workplace is the place we spend more time than anywhere else, and we all know that from our life experience. Secondly, in this time of really radical globalization and change and all these things, we think that a lot of societal progress is actually being defined without the gospel in the room. And if we can cultivate our own spiritual imagination and bring that into a lot of the settings where we're already have the privilege of leading, that's good not just for some Christian culture war where we win, but it's actually good news for everyone else. And along those lines, if we think about the church's public witness, what we're mostly known for, we really believe that we're entering into a time where people are less interested in exactly just hearing the gospel, just here's what it means, but they want to see it lived out. They want to see it embodied in communities like this one, and they want to see it embodied in daily life and work. And that's the idea of praxis, that there's orthodoxy, what we believe, and there's orthopraxy, how we go out and live our lives out. So we think that's just critically important for our personal witness and the church's larger public witness. And so those are kind of the large arcs and narratives that I hope we're entering into this morning by talking about this idea of redemptive work. So I'm going to walk you through a kind of a core framework we have at Praxis that we use to talk with our entrepreneurs about. And basically it's this idea that redemptive work has an alternative imagination that comes out of what we call the leader's script, what's internally motivating the leadership team, or you as an individual. And out from there, what intent our work has. What's our strategic intent? Are we exploiting the culture? Are we renewing the culture? And then ultimately also how we go about doing the things that we do. So it's not just about what we make, but it's about how we make it. Do we use people, or do we honor and bless them in that process? And so we'll talk a little bit about that. I'll give you a couple case studies I think are interesting. But again, it's kind of a take on what we create, the idea that the outputs, the products and services and spaces and brands that we make can be reimagined as virtuous, beautiful, restorative, God-glorifying work. And also how we create can be reimagined too. When we think about things like our workplace culture, the compensation strategy, sales, supply chain, ownership structure, capital, all these different things that kind of compose the how we go about doing things, some of which we have more influence over than others, those can be reimagined too. A lot of times by bringing a different lexicon and language into our workplace, and thinking about grace and forgiveness and generosity and justice and dignity. A lot of times things we always or often think about in our personal Christian lives, but don't often think about integrating deeply into our workplace language and lives. So, but again, like I said, ultimately those things come out of who we are as individuals and kind of the reimagination of our own selves and our own ambition, which I'm going to talk about a little bit in this kind of two-part talk. Really two key pathways that I think exist to redemptive work. And I'll talk about my own personal story as it relates to the first one as well, briefly. But basically, I think first we have to, kind of as a prerequisite to redemptive possibility, transform our inner script, the things that are driving us and animating us, saying that this is kind of a ceiling to possibility. And then secondly, that we need to pursue this idea of the redemptive edge, which we'll get into a bit. So this first part, again, I just want to underscore, this is not a prescription or a recipe that has been figured out, but basically what I want to talk about is just things we continually must do battle with as believers. Some of this may be familiar, but at the core of this idea of redemptive work is this idea of restoration through sacrifice. If we can think about that. If we think about how things are made better in the world, it usually has to do with us leaving something on the table personally to create more possibility for something else or someone else. Obviously, this is most embodied in the life of Jesus and making the ultimate sacrifice to restore the ultimate thing, which was us to him. And so we think this is a great model for how we do redemptive work as the hands and feet of Christ down on earth. Now, of course, this is embodied in a way in this famous scripture from Matthew 6 that we can't serve two masters, and that we can't serve mammon and God at the same time, right? And we see that idea as being connected to this restoration through sacrifice theme. Another way of thinking about this is maybe an under-talked about idea of how we imagine the good life, which has this sort of ambiguous carrier in our culture of some future that is the thing we're aiming at, right? This is a scholarly piece that says, the good life is a lot of times construed in a lot of different ways, but there's really two meanings that the society talks about when they talk about the good life. Think about this related to Matthew 6. Either one, it's a life abounding in material comforts and luxuries, and that becomes our pursuit, or two, it's a life lived according to the moral and religious laws of culture. So there's these two possibilities. Matthew 6 reframed might be, this is the Eugene Peterson remix, baby, we can't live for both of these visions of the good life at the same time, right? Another scholar, John Morse, looking at advertising culture in our world, said that virtue theory, this idea of us becoming who we're becoming, is actually related to a person's conception of the good life, and that imagination, whatever it is in your mind that you're seeking, it actually sets the ends, goals, and purposes of your acts, and as such, your conception of the good life is really the fundamental source of human action. If you read between the lines a little bit on this, this is basically suggesting that we have this subconscious narrative that we're always working through that's actually ordering the decisions we make. This isn't the thing that, I'm going to tell Will when I say, hey, here's the things I'm living for. It's actually the things in the depths of my heart that are actually pulling me in a particular direction. So, said again, in any given moment, in any year, job, or venture, we're either dying to ourselves or we're living for ourselves. I think those are basically the two visions of the good life. And we don't make a singular decision that sets us on a single path, although there's those moments. But every day we decide which pathway we're on. So just to give you a small frame on how we think about this from the role of what we create in the world, there's a famous quote from Victor Lebo, who wrote kind of in the middle of consumerism coming into the culture this. He said, "Our enormously productive economy demands that we make consumption our way of life, that we convert the buying and use of goods into rituals, that we seek our spiritual satisfactions, our ego satisfactions in consumption. The measure of our social status, of social acceptance, of prestige is now to be found in our consumptive patterns." What a big idea to say that we should find our spiritual satisfactions in the things we consume. And in many ways, the last 60 years since Lebo wrote this is our lived experience of brands and organizations trying to suggest to us that this is the way that we find meaning in life. And certainly I have bought this narrative more than once myself. In fact, I'm sure we all have in different ways. This is actually my favorite image that embodies it. This is one that I love to just look at. This is, of course, Sean Connery, James Bond, in a Louis Vuitton ad, where you can kind of get a sense for what Lebo's talking about, right? Spiritual satisfactions, ego satisfactions, all being wrapped up in this idea that if you purchase this bag, and live in a normal context and are not Sean Connery, we can at least get a taste of this. And what I like about this is that it's so false. It's such a false reality. Even if we dissect the image for a second, I actually think it's hilarious because what we see here is that there's this private island, right? It's clearly Sean Connery's the only one there, so seems kind of lonely maybe even. If you look really close, you might not be able to tell, but the bag is actually soaking wet. So we know that Mr. Connery went swimming with his Louis Vuitton. Kind of a crazy idea. He's on this beautifully warm tropical island, but he's decided to wear probably a cashmere turtleneck, which doesn't make a lot of sense. It's this whole constructed reality of a vision of the good life, right? To be had, down the street at the Louis Vuitton boutique, at least in a component. This is obviously a reality of how organizations try to load meaning into their work. If we look at what Dallas Willard says think about Lebo and the Vuitton ad, he said that ideas and images, perhaps like those two, are the primary focus of Satan's effort to defeat God's purposes for humankind. The primary focus. This is the basic idea behind all temptation. God is presented as depriving us by his commands of what is good, and as a result, we think we must take matters into our own hands and act contrary to what he has said. And this is like a daily challenge, right? Is God speaking truth to us, or are these others? And we see 5,000 ads a day. It's particularly interesting in the sense of us being able to actually even get a sense for the context that we live in. This is one of my favorite charts. This is from a Princeton dissertation called Slouching Towards Utopia by Bradford DeLong. This talks about growth in material wealth across centuries and kind of sets us in a context of where we are in human history and how good our life is. You can imagine, so Lebo wrote in this century that we need to figure out how to make consumption more of a way of life. But we see that in the context of human history and incredible provision for where we are. And that should reposition how much we actually internalize and reject some of these ideas and images. Again, this is something that my story is so connected to my own story. So I was in kind of short form here because of time, I was a pastor's kid, grew up in the church, as Will said, rented space to my friends in second grade to get a commission off their baseball card sales. I was always an entrepreneur, and about 16 or 17, I think I had just kind of hit apathy in my faith. I had not taken ownership of it as a young person, and for the next 10 years, I really lived out a story of pursuit of wealth. I found myself at the age of 26 at an emotional bottom and a financial peak. Maybe that's something some of you have experienced, I don't know. But, it wasn't a ton of money, but I was making $600,000-$700,000 a year at the age of 26, and looking around on the Louis Vuitton type of island, and wondering, is this all that life has to offer? Is this really the way that that God has designed the world? And I really put my identity in the income I had and the possessions I owned and all those things. And today, still say that the most significant failure was having the wrong imagination for the good life, and even allowing that to creep in and then ultimately take over the things I set my heart to. Really feeling like I wasted a large portion of my young life on that pursuit. And since then, I would say has been a trying to recover the correct imagination for the good life. Again, not saying I've figured it all out and I don't wrestle with anything anymore. Fully sanctified here in front of you today, but more that at least there's something to hold on to. So this is the kind of idea of a leader script and how we might reimagine ourselves. And I think one of the ways we have to do that is by thinking about practices. Sometimes we think about spiritual practices as things we're supposed to do, instead of things that are actually helping govern and bound some of these other desires or visions of the good life. So things like Sabbath, things like surrendering our will, tithing and generosity, they're all actually combative to the way of the world. And they work against, they allow us to, in smaller moments on the weekend, leave our work for the Lord and set aside some of our own mission and vision and ambition that can go off the rails. Said another way, this is one of the most challenging books I've ever read. It's called Dismissing Jesus by this guy, Doug Jones. This is the kind of summary to me of the different script that we need as believers that we have to press into. He says, the gospel of Christ is not primarily about getting into heaven or about living a comfortable, individually pious, middle-class life. It is about being free from the ancient, pervasive, and delightful oppression of mammon, in order to create a very different community, the church, an alternative city kingdom here and now on earth by means of living and celebrating the way of the cross, the reign of joyful weakness, renunciation, self-denial, sharing, foolishness, community, and love overcoming evil. Those are challenging words, but truly the Sermon on the Mount lived out. And that's really our opportunity, I believe, to transform our inner script, which gives possibility to how we go forward as redemptive actors in the world. So we're not going to pause here because we're going to keep moving for the sake of time, but just a couple things to think about maybe throughout the rest of the day and throughout the rest of your life. What's maybe the biggest temptation for you as it relates to imagining the good life? And what are the practices that you need to implement and put in place to combat that? To name that and put a practice in place to continue to resist that is a powerful thing. So moving on, the second idea of this pathway to redemptive imagination, which I say I've been in this pursuit for the last 7-8 years of my life, is to pursue the redemptive edge of the place that we've been put. The redemptive edge to us on this frame, at least, is this place out here where we go beyond kind of doing good when it benefits us to sacrificing something in a different way that we think represents the upside-down nature of the gospel, and particularly within the lens of what we do at work on a regular basis. This is an exciting place, I think, where people in the marketplace have a particularly unique role to take theological depth and cultural analysis out into the world through markets and models, right? Because it's really nice to think up here and have it have no consequences on the world that we inhabit. But we have this opportunity to take these things out as we understand them. So again, thinking about how does this shape what we create and how we reimagine the things that we are putting into the world, no matter how small or large our role is, whether you see yourself as creative fundamentally or not, you are involved in culture making. You are a part of a firm or an engine or a whatever, or even a family that's putting things into the world. And we need to all think about how can we move from simply exploiting the culture that we live in to the renewal of it. Let me give you a quick kind of contrasting case study. This is Jonas Paul Eyewear. Ben and Laura Harrison were the founders of it. They had their son, Jonas Paul, here, as their firstborn, ended up being nearly blind, has had 21 surgeries to try to get his eyesight back. Really devastating, challenging situation. Although Jonas Paul is a beautiful child. And somehow out of this, his parents said, we want to create a kids' eyewear company that tries to reshape the social stigma around kids and eyewear. Right? We live in this funny world where from birth to, I don't know, call it like 7th grade or something, it's the worst thing in the world to have eyeglasses and your 4 eyes and so on and on. And then, when you get to high school, everybody's like, I don't care if I can't see. Like, I want eyeglasses from Warby Parker and style and all this. And there's this shift. So they said, how can we shift the social stigma around kids and their loss of confidence that happens as they're younger and all these different things. And so they started this company that's now doing over $1 million in revenue and is really helping reverse this social stigma. Contrast this to a piece I found in Booz Allen's Strategy and Business magazine from a few years ago. And the way they say, the right way to achieve profitable growth in the Chinese consumer market. This is basically they're suggesting that if you're a client, a potential client, you should come to them and they'll help you do this. They say too often companies focus only on understanding the current demand of the consumer. A better course is to anticipate or even create demand. Through smart marketing, Procter & Gamble, for example, created the perception that dandruff, which is traditionally a non-issue for the Chinese, is actually a social stigma. And they offered a product, Head & Shoulders Anti-Dandruff Shampoo, to solve, quote unquote, the problem. Today, Procter & Gamble controls more than half the shampoo market in urban China. This is set up as an ideal case study for how to do things, creating stigma for people. What a sad angle. And that's just, what we create and the brand and the vision and how we talk about things and things put in the world. Obviously, there's a whole world that simply means renewal in how we do things. I think it was Augustine who famously said, we either use people for our own power and privilege, or we use our power and privilege on behalf of other people. And I think that's the tension we're talking about every day, again, when we go to work. How do we balance these things? And how do we maybe reimagine what's possible in the execution? Now, maybe you're in a large firm where you feel like, how could I possibly influence anything? Well, you always have influence over your peers and your boss and the people who work for you, even if it's just 1 degree of influence. And that has trickle-down effects in many, many different ways. And yes, these things are at times wildly countercultural. But let me give you, again, some contrasting examples in a space maybe some of you work in finance. If you're not familiar with John Montgomery, John runs a firm called Bridgeway in Houston, Texas. It's an $8 billion quantitative mutual fund that he started about 2 decades ago. He's the founder and CIO. John's one of the most redemptive entrepreneurs I know. And he said when he started the firm that he wanted to create something different, something virtuous, something restorative. And you'll see all the way through this how he's trying to participate in restoration through sacrifice. This is a Forbes article on the Bridgeway solution. There's a lot of people who try to make sense of what John does, and this is just one of the pieces out there. If you're in finance, this will mean maybe more to you than some others, but here's just some of the things they do at Bridgeway, and they've done since the start. There's no soft dollar commissions. Fund manager salaries are disclosed. The highest paid employee, that's John, makes no more than 7 times the salary of his lowest paid employee. That's his assistant who makes 6 figures. Half of the company's projects are donated to charity. Fund managers are forbidden to trade on their own accounts. They can invest in stocks only through Bridgeway funds. Most funds have performance-based management fees, which reward Bridgeway if it does well and penalizes it if it does poorly. Funds are closed to new investments before they become big and unwieldy. Trading costs are kept as low as possible with careful attention to brokerage expenses. So this is all kind of a model that John has put out towards recasting an imagination for how they go about doing things, and of course what they're making in the world as well. One of the most just imaginatively great things that I think is they mentioned half the company's profits are donated to charity. So one of the things that John said when he started it was that they wanted to take a significant role in fighting human genocide. So I love this idea that there's this connection between a quantitative mutual fund in Houston and fighting international genocide. Literally, sometimes training armies to take down bad guys. This is a piece in the New Yorker where the header is how a Texas philanthropist helped fund the hunt for Joseph Kony. If you know Kony, he was the head of the LRA, a brutal, violent regime. They are credited with reducing violence from the LRA by 96% in the course of about 3 years, using the funds from Bridgeway, almost single-handedly. So this is just an example of a different way to do things. And the quick contrast here, something we're probably all familiar with, is the latest situation with Wells Fargo. I picked this. Could have picked a few, but I picked this because of the journalist's tagline here. Says the modern financial economy has no room for honesty. No room for honesty. So, John would differ. John would say it has plenty of room for it. This model doesn't mean that everything's gone well with investing. There's been ups and downs and good times and bad times, but there is redemptive possibility in every corner. And Bono has a famous saying. I think that it says like we all should just try to tear off a corner of the darkness in the world. I think that's what John's trying to do. He hasn't reimagined all of mutual funds, but it's a significant thing. So this is maybe a question for today, and again, an ongoing question I hope for each of you is, in your kind of pocket of work or where you are, what is the redemptive edge? How can you, where are some areas where you might take what's in your heart and in the things that you make and how you go about making them, just push past doing a good thing, but actually leave something on the table to create redemptive opportunity for someone else, be it someone in your organization or the broader society as a whole. That's a question we can always be asking, and I think is central to how the gospel goes forward in the world. Now, just a couple kind of ending thoughts here in my final minutes. First is that it's not simple stuff. Redemptive work is executed within real tensions that we have to recognize and that we have to accept. First, I would say there's kind of three quick tensions to think about. First is our ambition, right? We often feel driven to build and build and build or do something in the world, but we also need to feel called into certain work. And so there's going to be this, I think, inherent, almost human nature and flesh and spirit war of what we build. This is not a tension to do less or be less ambitious, but it is an orientation of what we're ambitious for and who we let govern our ambition, ourselves or the Lord. There's also what I would say is an impact tension. The idea of if we do want to, in fact, say things to the market that are different through our work and be prophetic in a sense as people in the workplace, how do we do that in tension with a market that requires sustainability, returns, profits, the other kind of profits? You could call this the profit-profit tension. But there's a real wrestling of, even as we think about scaling things up, do we want scale that's a little less prophetic, or do we want something that is really saying something in a radically different way, but maybe can't get the same traction? Maybe John Montgomery is only going to manage $10 billion instead of a half a trillion. He may not be BlackRock, but that's one of the models. Because there are limitations in the narrow way. And the last one, which I think we all will always face, is this idea of what I'll call formation tension. So, how much time and energy and focus are we giving to forming ourselves as individuals versus forming the enterprises that we are part of building or working for? That is maybe the largest tension that we see in the lives of entrepreneurs. Is there is a default, actually, because of ambition and vision and all these things, to spend the majority of our attention and focus and even our imagination of the good life in a growing, successful, thriving enterprise, all while sacrificing again, the redemptive possibility that comes from forming our inner script on an ongoing basis. So, but knowing that those things are in tension, that we don't have unlimited time and we have to pick and choose and allocate and try to do them in the same step when possible. So again, redemptive work is really hard work, but I hope to leave you with this last quote. I always ask for credit that on this that you give me for pronouncing the name of the person. This is Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. Yes, I worked on that. He's one of the great psychologists of our time, and I love what he says here because this should be animating for us as believers. He says, the unifying similarity among geniuses and innovators is not cognitive or affective, but it's motivational. What is common among them is the unwillingness or inability to strive for goals that everyone else accepts. So what he's saying here is, in many ways, whether this should be our ambition or not, to be geniuses and innovators, but what he's saying is the people who move the needle, you don't have to be the brightest person in the room. You don't have to come up with the greatest technical invention. You don't have to be charismatic. You just have to actually be committed to a different way of doing something. You have to be motivated by that. And I think as Christians, fundamentally, we should be unable to strive for the same goals that everyone else accepts in the world. Those are the goals of mammon. And so I hope that you can take that with you actually as encouragement to go out and try to do something a little bit different. Try to build your redemptive imagination in the place where God has put you. And with commitment to that, break out new possibility for the kingdom here on earth as it is in heaven. So that's all I've got. Thanks again for having me. Let me speak with you all today, and really appreciate what you do here as a community of believers.